Good evening. For those who don't know me, my name is Kim Davenport, and it is a pleasure to be with you once again for a virtual presentation on local history. I very much look forward to the day when we can begin gathering in person again. But that said, it's been really wonderful that Tacoma Historical Society has found some new ways to reach out to people in the community, and I really hope you've been enjoying our online content. As you look at this first slide of my presentation and see these faces from the Stadium High School class of 1933, I want to begin by explaining where this presentation came from, because it very much grew out of this situation that we are all living through right now. This is a pandemic-generated presentation, in other words. As a teacher, and I teach at a couple of different local universities, and also I teach private music lessons. So I come into contact with a lot of students of different ages, and I personally know many 2020 graduates. And I've been thinking a lot about what they're going through right now. The fact that they are graduating into a situation very much unlike what they were expecting. I know a young woman who's just graduating from Foss High School this spring, and I know many graduates from UPS and UW-Tacoma, all of whom I will first say have been really impressive in their ability to handle this situation, but also have really been dealing with a lot of uncertainty. And this led me to wonder, have there been other times in our history when recent graduates have come into the world, begun their adulthood, started their careers, however you want to look at that, in such a time of fear and uncertainty? As a researcher, I've also been contending with the fact that this has been a really frustrating time because I'm someone who will look for any excuse to visit the library, to visit an archive, to touch an artifact, to delve into a story and then share it with people. And it's been really tough during a time when I am not leaving my house except to go to the grocery store and occasionally go out and get some exercise. And so I've been trying to find a story that I could research just using materials that I have in my own home or that are available on the internet. And so this is the result. So as you look at these 5 faces on the screen, I want to give you a little bit of background about where I was coming from in both putting this together and also thinking about how it could inform how we understand what we're all going through right now. Depending on your age and your level of immersion in Tacoma history, there are 2 fairly famous faces on this screen. The others are less known. One of them you'd recognize if you're related to me because she's my grandmother. More about that in a few minutes. But I didn't necessarily choose people just because they were famous or significant. I chose stories that I thought were interesting, just as you could with any high school yearbook as an artifact. Thinking of a yearbook as an artifact that can be a pathway to find some interesting stories is really where I was coming from. So I have many areas of interest when it comes to local history. And I think for many of us who are interested in local history, at least part of that comes from a desire to understand our roots. And for me, all 4 of my grandparents were roughly this age, high school graduating age, at this time in the Pacific Northwest. My mother's father graduated from Roosevelt High School in Seattle. My father's father from Lincoln, here in Tacoma, go Abes, in 1935. My father's mother is a really good example of what happened to many students of this generation. She was a great student, but had to leave school after the 11th grade and go to work, which was happening for a lot of families in that time. And lastly, at the bottom left of the screen here, my grandmother Maureen was the valedictorian of the Stadium class of 1933. So I found myself curious to learn more, not just about her story, but also some of her classmates. And I knew about the significant names that came out of that class. I won't keep you in suspense any further. At the top center of the picture is Dixie Lee Ray, who would go on to be Washington State's first female governor. And at top right is Murray Morgan, who is a very familiar name to anyone who has spent any time looking at local history. The other names, again, not quite so famous, but still interesting stories. And I want to start with some context about this class. This was the largest class that Stadium had seen to date. There were 540 members of the class of 1933. And that seemed like a huge number when I first saw it, and then I realized it made sense. Tacoma still had just 2 high schools at this date, and Tacoma's population had been growing dramatically. So all the classes in the 30s from both Stadium and Lincoln were fairly large. Members of this class were born during World War I. They survived the flu pandemic of 1918 as toddlers or small children, and the number of deaths that are estimated from that pandemic in Tacoma is about 500, and that's in a city with less than half the population we have now. So certainly enough to make an impact, certainly enough for people to have fear and trepidation in their families and to leave a mark on the families that went through that. Before I delve into the specific stories, I wanted to share just one quote from this foreword to the school yearbook, which just very gently touches on the difficulties that these children faced as youngsters. So I'm quoting kind of from the middle of this text. "During your 3 years at Stadium, circumstances have compelled many of you to face unusual and difficult personal problems. These same problems or greater ones must still be encountered. May you continue to meet them with courage and determination." So the questions I was asking myself as I engaged in this research: how would growing up at this time, surviving a pandemic as a toddler, starting high school at the beginning of the Great Depression, graduating from high school in the middle of the Depression, how would this impact people? Would it be revealed in what they did later in their life? Would we be able to see that when we look back at their lives? And what thoughts can we take away from that for our current moment, for people who are graduating right now, for all of us living through this moment right now? So I'm going to begin with my grandmother, my mother's mother, Maureen, at this point in her life, Henderson, and she had a few nicknames. It was interesting to me to see that pretty much every senior in the yearbook for 1933 had a nickname. I wonder if they had them whether they liked it or not, or whether they all enjoyed that. That kind of intrigued me. One of her nicknames was Hendy. The other was Red, though. She had red hair, and that's what you see here. So let me back up to the beginning of her life. So Maureen was born in 1915 in South Dakota. She was the only girl and the middle child. There were 5 children in her family. Her father was a lawyer who worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and traveled frequently for work. And it was on a train journey to Tacoma, and I don't know why he was coming to Tacoma specifically, but he came out to Tacoma for work in the early 1920s. And the story goes, and I have not seen the letter, but my mother remembers seeing the letter. He sent a letter home to his wife, which in effect said, "The City of Destiny is phenomenal. If anything should happen to me, you need to pick up and move the family to Tacoma." And unfortunately, he did pass away in 1927 at just the age of 48, and his widow took his advice and moved the family to Tacoma. So even though none of them had ever been here, and they knew no one here, by late 1929, the entire family had arrived in Tacoma and moved into a house on North Houston Street. Maureen's 2 older brothers were old enough to begin working, so the family had a source of income and were doing relatively well. And this gave her the opportunity to focus entirely on school. She began at Mason, finishing out junior high school, and then moved on to Stadium, where she truly excelled, as you can see from her many, many activities listed here in the yearbook. She was elected brainiest girl and girl most likely to succeed. I always think those are such funny snapshots of our lives, right? Because who knows how accurate those might be. Mine was in my middle school yearbook, least changed since 6th grade, and I remember that really bothered me at the time. Now I think it's okay. I think I'm okay with it now. Among the many friendships she made along the way to having all these successes and graduating as valedictorian. But among her many important friendships, one was Marie Morgan, who I will touch on at the end of this presentation. Also among her many friends were many young people of Japanese American heritage, and this led me to want to discover how many of those students of that heritage were at Stadium. So that will bring us to the next person I'll talk about. She also made a very close friend of Japanese heritage named Katie Yamamoto when she was at the College of Puget Sound. And the Yamamoto family from Puyallup all became close friends of my grandmother and later her whole family. And this is the story I chose to share. I could share any number of stories about my grandmother, of course, family stories, but this was the one I decided to focus on. So after finishing at CPS, she was working in downtown Tacoma. This is where she met my grandfather, Clark Tuttle. They were married in 1941, not long before the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and that event, of course, turned their lives and many, many other lives upside down. So within the span of less than a year, she would see her husband go off to war, and she would also see many of her friends be rounded up and forced to leave their homes and jobs and school and families to go off to internment camps, simply because of their Japanese heritage. Now, thanks to my cousin having loaned me these letters before, right around Christmas, before this pandemic started, I actually have in my possession right now a handful of letters sent to my grandmother from members of the Yamamoto family from the Minidoka camp in Idaho. And I decided just to share one of the envelopes with you so you could see that artifact. And what the letters reveal is a lot of fear and frustration and boredom and uncertainty for the future. And they also reveal some everyday practical needs, like sending along $1 or $2 and asking for my grandmother to send back fabric so that they could sew some new clothing, things like that. She would bake cookies and send those, send jars of jam, for example. But one day my grandmother decided, this isn't good enough. I need to be able to see my friends. And by herself, she got on the train, went to Minidoka, and marched up to the gate and insisted to be let in to see her friends. I'm sure those guards at that gate were very surprised that this redheaded lady from Tacoma demanded to be let in, but they did let her in. She saw them, and that really reinforced that long-term friendship between those families over the many years. After the war, my grandparents settled in Seattle and started their family. My mother was the oldest of their 4 children. And for me, as I hope this picture reveals, she was just grandma. She spent less time telling me stories about her past than she did teaching me how to make chocolate chip cookies and zucchini bread, taking me and my cousins on vacations in the summer. She was willing, when my parents were not, she was willing to play endless hours of card games with me. So she was just a source of unconditional love, which is something I would never trade. But that said, I so wish I had asked her more questions. I so wish I had known more of these stories. And so my takeaway for anyone watching right now is, grandparents, talk to your kids, talk to your grandkids, share your stories. Don't wait till it's too late. But seriously, share your stories with your families. It's important. All right, I want to move on now to the next student I want to feature. So in spite of the very large size of the graduating class, there were only a handful of Japanese American students in this class, this graduating class. There were a few more at Lincoln High School, so I think that just shows where people were living in town, what was closer perhaps, but still not a large number. And I needed to find one of these students about which I could find enough information to share, again, without being able to go to the library. What could I find just using the internet? The Stomy nickname that you see here for Tsutomu, I think was a typo because everywhere else throughout his life he went by Stony with an N. And Stoney was born in 1913 in McKenna. And as the note here in the yearbook mentions, he attended Eatonville High School for a semester. So that made me think, okay, was he actually living in Eatonville? Why go to Stadium? What was that connection there between Eatonville and Tacoma? And I admit I didn't know a lot about the Japanese population in Eatonville, so that was a good source of learning for me. So it was the Eatonville Lumber Company that led to a sizable Japanese population in Eatonville. As early as 1910, that company was recruiting Japanese workers to come to live in Eatonville and work at that factory. Pretty soon, many of those workers, who in that era were all men, brought their wives and children and started settling down in Eatonville and becoming a part of the community. So the workers of Japanese descent, by all accounts, worked alongside Caucasian workers for the same pay, and were members of the company's apparently very successful baseball team. That was something I found reference to online. But they were not allowed to own houses in town, and so they lived in a series of makeshift shacks that developed near the lumber mill. One other really fascinating story I found about the Japanese community in Eatonville is that in 1915 there was a dramatic fire in downtown Eatonville, and it had reached the town's hardware store, which everyone knew had a stock of dynamite in the back. And as the story goes, it was the Japanese men from the mill who risked their own lives to run in and get the dynamite out of the building before this disaster became much, much worse. So the Tacoma City Directory shows young Tsutomu moving to Tacoma, either while he was still going to Stadium or fairly immediately after his graduation from Stadium. So my guess, my educated guess, without being able to go to the library and research further, is that he wasn't yet able to get a job at the mill in Eatonville, and so he came into Tacoma to work. By the time of the 1940 census, though, he was back in Eatonville. He was listed living there in the Japanese section. Again, not being able to own houses, they didn't actually have addresses, but there's a page in the census that lists those residents. And he was employed as an attendant at a gas station there. And then by the time he filled out his draft card, his World War II draft card, he was finally employed at the Eatonville Lumber Company. So my sense is that those jobs were not easy to get. One had to maybe put in their dues and have some other work experience before they could get those jobs. So in 1941, he married Fumiko Nakamura, who was a year behind him at Stadium. Not long after their wedding, this parallels my grandparents' story, not long after their wedding, Pearl Harbor was bombed, and this would change everyone's life very quickly. And as anti-Japanese sentiment rose, members of Eatonville's Japanese Americans Citizens League prepared a letter which Stoney and Fumiko both signed, which appeared in the December 9th, 1941 issue of the Eatonville Dispatch, the Eatonville newspaper. And it read as follows: "The members of the Eatonville Committee of Japanese American Citizens League, in complete accord with the national organization in this time of war and national emergency, do hereby pledge our wholehearted support to our country, the United States of America, to our community, our leaders, and to all the principles for which they stand. American soil has been ruthlessly invaded even as we sought peace. American lives have been taken. There should not be any slightest doubt in the mind of any true citizen as to the course which we all must follow. We pledge our all to prosecute this war to the bitter end and victory. America needs every American, and every American must do his share. We will all work together for the country we love, and to crush a foe gone mad." But regardless of this pledge of loyalty to the country, it was on May 16th, 1942, that all of the families of Japanese heritage in Eatonville were loaded onto buses and taken away, following President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. By June, the young couple, Stoney and Fumiko, were living at the camp at Tule Lake, California. So the two pictures I have here The first is not specifically of Stoney and Fumiko. I was not able to find pictures of them in Eatonville, but this is a picture of members of the Japanese community in Eatonville on top. And then at bottom is a picture of the camp at Tule Lake. And I wouldn't have been satisfied or willing to share this story if I couldn't bring it to its conclusion. So thankfully I was able to. I was able to find out what happened to this couple after the war. Like most of the Japanese community of Tacoma, of Eatonville, of a lot of local cities and towns, they did not return to this area after the war. Even though their removal was not specifically at the hands of local officials, it was a federal order, I think there was still a sense that what had been home was no longer home. So instead, they settled in Chicago, where Stoney ran Stoney's Standard Service Station. Apparently he liked alliteration. And after his retirement, they moved to Fort Wayne, Indiana. And he was Fort Wayne, Indiana's men's senior bowling champion, and was also honored by the local Fishing Hall of Fame. And of course, I had to look that up. In 1978, he caught an 11-pound half-ounce walleye and a 7 3/4-pound walleye in the same day, which I know nothing about fishing, but apparently that was enough to be honored by the local Fishing Hall of Fame. Fumiko, this is her high school senior photo, by the way, passed away in 2000, and Stoney in 2009 at the age of 96. So I think this might be the longest of the list of accomplishments that I found for any of the students I chose to profile. This is Dixie Lee Ray. And it's clear from this list of accomplishments that she was capable and energetic. It's also clear from her later achievements that she was determined, that she was brilliant and capable, especially in academics and science. And that she was a woman who had what she needed in order to be willing to break down many barriers. So Ray was born in Tacoma in 1914. She was the second in a family of 5 girls, and she quickly revealed herself both to be very quick-witted and to be a tomboy. Her original name actually was Marguerite, but she changed it herself legally at the age of 16. When she was very young, she was referred to as the Little Dickens, which is my understanding from that era, a polite way of saying a real pain to the adults in the room. So Dickens evolved to Dixie, that became a nickname, and she legally changed her name in 1930 to Dixie Lee. Also an evidence of her precocious nature, at age 12, she became the youngest girl on record at the time to have climbed Mount Rainier. So clearly a very energetic, accomplished, capable young woman. After leaving Stadium, she went on to earn not just her undergraduate degree, which in itself was relatively unusual for a woman of the time, but all the way. She earned her doctorate in zoology from Stanford. And in 1945, she became a member of the faculty of the zoology department at the University of Washington. She was the only female professor in that department for that year and many thereafter. In 1947, she was promoted, and in 1957, promoted again, and she would remain on the faculty at UW until 1976, when she became governor. During her years on the faculty at UW, she hosted a television show for KCTS, the PBS station in Seattle, called Animals of the Sea. She also stepped in to lead what's now called the Pacific Science Center, really jumping in to oversee the transition from when it was a failing relic of Seattle's World's Fair in 1962 into a really progressive, forward-looking public science museum that it still is today. There's a little bit of video that I wanted to share of her in 1962 talking about what this new museum is going to be.
Our guide for exploring this world is Dr. Dixie Lee Ray, distinguished scientist on the faculty of the University of Washington.
The world today is made, is powered, is penetrated through and through with science. For any man to disclaim an interest in science and to dismiss it as someone else's concern is to live on Main Street with his eyes blinded and his mind closed. Yet the scope of science is so broad, its fields of activity so diverse, and its achievements so rapid and so accelerating that we cannot hope to encompass all of the knowledge that is essential and increasingly important for every intelligent citizen to make the decisions that are demanded of us. Let us look into the face of the future. Here we see the problems whose shadows already lengthen over the land: increasing population, diminishing resources, pollution of fresh water, the sea, and the air, disease, ignorance, and war. Is this the prospect that we face? Or through knowledge and understanding, can we shape our future, not to a life of ease, but to one that is worthy of the dignity of the human mind and spirit? We have entered upon the space age. This means new concepts of size and time and shape and matter. It means a change in our perspectives and our thinking. How would we look upon the universe if we sat on a star? Suppose we could see into a molecule, an atom, or look inside a living cell. What are the physical laws that govern the universe? Those that govern the biological world? Are they real? Immutable? Does our understanding of them change? Science is the search for hidden likenesses in the great diversity of all things around us, large and small. It seeks the beauty of order, and the sense of personal exploration is as great and as intense in this adventure of the mind as it is in any aspect of the arts. We look to the frontiers of the future with confidence in the knowledge that man masters nature not by force, but through understanding. And it is to this end of understanding that the United States Science Exhibit is organized and directed.
So in 1976, after a few years of service in the Nixon administration on the Atomic Energy Commission, Dixie Lee Ray surprised a lot of people in Washington state politics by announcing that she was running for governor. And we see here on the left campaign ad that probably wouldn't be worded this way now, but at the time was timely. When she was elected governor in 1976, she became only the second woman in the country to be elected governor of a state. There had been a few women who had finished out their husbands' terms after they had passed away, but only two had been elected at that point. And anyone who's watching who's old enough to remember her time in Washington state politics will probably remember her controversial and varied opinions on a variety of topics, her unconventional manner of dress, her willingness to say really anything she believed, even if she knew it wasn't the politically expedient thing to say. She was truly an unusual and uncharacteristic politician. And maybe that's why her political career came to an end after just one term. But she did make an impact nonetheless. One thing that I found interesting as someone who I was alive during her term, but I don't remember it. I was too young a child to be paying attention to who governor was. But one thing that I found interesting in my research is that she was, of course, still in office. The end of her term was when Mount St. Helens blew. And she's credited with saving many thousands of lives because as a scientist, she was adamant and demanded that people listen to her plan to create a zone out of which people must evacuate. Of course, not everyone evacuated. We know that story. But she is credited with saving a large number of lives during that disaster. Dixie Lee Ray passed away in 1994 at her home on Fox Island. And before we move on to the next story I want to share, there's a little bit more footage of her that I want to bring to you. I was kind of surprised to find this. She was being interviewed after one of her books came out, but she talks about the beginning of her life in Tacoma.
Where are you living now?
I live on an island in the southern part of Puget Sound in my home state of Washington.
One of the first things you do for us in this book is take us back to the early days of your life.
Yes.
And obviously, it must not be too sensitive, but you basically tell us in here that you're what, close to 77 years old?
I will be 77 in about 2 months, 3 months, yes.
What about those early years did you want us to know?
That times have changed enormously. That over the course of a single lifetime, and I have to tell you, I beat the odds. When I was born, my life expectancy was much less than the number of years that I have actually lived. And one of the reasons for that is that life has become better. We're living in a cleaner environment. We're more healthy. I have greater relief from hard physical labor. And all in all, it's a better life than it used to be. So I describe what it was like when I grew up. It was dirty. It was smelly. There were very few household appliances that could help with the drudgery of housework. Sickness was a fact of life. Infectious diseases always struck every year, and particularly for children, many did not survive. Tuberculosis was rampant. We sometimes forget all those things when we think about the, quote, good old days when life was more simple. We didn't have fresh vegetables in the wintertime because we didn't have refrigeration, because CFCs hadn't been invented, and so there wasn't any Freon gas, and so on and so on and so on. I try to make the contrast of all the things that have happened to improve life in the course of my 77 years of being here.
All right, so I showed you earlier my grandmother who was voted girl most likely to succeed. Here is boy most likely to succeed. His name was Hugh Thompson, and he was born in Tacoma in June of 1915. His father, Oscar, was for many years an editor and music critic with the Tacoma Ledger. And by the time he was in high school, Hugh was actually living with his grandparents, his grandmother being one of his primary music teachers, because his father had actually moved to New York by that point to become chief music critic for the New York Sun and executive director of Musical America, which was one of the most prominent national music magazines of the era. Immediately after his graduation from Stadium, Hugh pursued admission to the Juilliard School of Music, but he was refused admission because of his young age. And I'm not sure from the stories whether they actually had a policy at the time about age, or whether that had more to do with the fact that he was a baritone singer, and male voices tend to develop a little bit later, and maybe they wanted him to come back in a few years when that voice was more developed. So he returned to the Northwest after living briefly in New York with his father and trying to get into school there, and spent 2 years at the University of Washington. And then he was finally admitted to Juilliard and spent 5 years studying there and establishing himself in the New York opera scene. So it's interesting looking back at his list of achievements. They're diverse. There's, let's see, what do we have here? First prize stamp exhibit in 1932, and he was a member of the debate club and things like that. But an awful lot of what's here has more to do with being on the stage, and that's not surprising because that is where he would spend much of his life. In 1941, and this is a fascinating story to me, Hugh was one of 3 national finalists for the Metropolitan Opera's Auditions of the Air, which were carried on NBC radio. Now, the reason this is interesting to me is, as a musician, I'm very aware of the Metropolitan Opera auditions, which still go on every year around the country. Usually they are done in regional auditions in a variety of locations around the country, and then people actually fly to New York when they are finalists. Well, these were the war years, and they needed an alternative to people expecting to travel around the country to these events. And they were also looking for a way to raise spirits around the country. So holding these auditions for these coveted roles with the Metropolitan Opera on national radio was an interesting and good idea. So Hugh was one of the finalists the very first year, which was 41. He didn't win, but he did win in 1944. So you can imagine that young student who was dying to get into Juilliard as a teenager and was rejected because he wasn't old enough yet. Finally, by 1944, his voice had developed into truly a winning voice. He won a $1,000 cash prize. That was quite a bit of money in 1944. But more importantly, he won a Metropolitan Opera contract, and that would really set his career on a path for great success. He made his debut on the Metropolitan Opera stage in December 1944 in La Boheme, in a performance that, not surprisingly, won a lot of praise from the music critic of the New York Sun, who you might remember from a few minutes ago was his father. Not saying there was anything crooked going on there, but it's an interesting fact. He would go on to perform in 238 different productions with the Metropolitan Opera. His last performance for the Met also made history. So he made history with that being a member of the class who won those on-the-air radio auditions. He also was a part of the first production that the Metropolitan Opera did for television. It was an omnibus production for CBS in 1953. In 1955, he began a second career, really, as a director, an opera director, even coming back to the Met to conduct operas there, and worked with some of the most prominent opera companies all around the country and taught at a variety of universities. Before we move on from Hugh, I do actually have one audio snippet so we can hear his voice. I was only able to find one, but let's hear just a little bit of Hugh's baritone voice. I bet you weren't expecting opera as part of this presentation. All right, so my final feature from the class of 1933 is going to be Murray Morgan. And this is undoubtedly the most familiar name of those I've shared for anyone who follows Tacoma history. So there are many people who will watch this presentation who actually knew Murray Morgan and who know more about him than I do. So I'm not going to try to tell you his whole biography. What I want to do is share a few things that I found interesting when delving a little bit more into his life than I have in the past. And I also want to end with some of his own words. My hope being that I can intrigue some people maybe who haven't read his work to learn more about it. So long before I knew his significance or had read any of his books, which I have now, I knew his name because he was a friend of my grandmother's and it was a name I heard mentioned. After they graduated from Stadium, their paths crossed again. He was briefly a writer and editor for a local newspaper down in Hoquiam, as was my grandmother. And I don't honestly know whether he got her that job or recommended her for that job or exactly the details of that, but I know that they had a true and lasting friendship that involved more than just being high school classmates. And that's actually something I have come across when reading about Morgan, is that he was a genuine and loyal and dedicated friend to everyone he came across and worked with in his life. Murray was born in Tacoma in February 1916, and he liked to tell the story, even though he couldn't possibly have remembered it himself. But as a historian, he liked to tell the story of the fact that he was born during a month that was largely shut down in our entire region. There had been almost 4 feet of snow at the end of January 1916, and then frigid temperatures kept it on the ground for the next month. His interest in writing initially came from his parents, both of whom were engaged in writing in one way or another. And as you can see from his involvement in high school, he was a writer and a journalist from a young age. And in fact, he actually became nationally published while he was still at Stadium. An article of his was published in Scholastic magazine. After graduating from Stadium, he went on to the University of Washington, where he eventually became the editor of the Daily, the student newspaper there. And he went on to earn his master's in journalism from Columbia University. So today, if you were just coming across Murray Morgan for the first time and trying to define who he was and what his importance was, the first label that might be logical to put on him would be author, because he did write more than 20 books. But that really does him a disservice, because he was so much more than that. He was a journalist, both here locally and also nationally. He was a radio personality. He hosted a news commentary show on KTNT radio here in Tacoma for 15 years called Our Town, Our World. He not only wrote history books, which again is what he's best known for, but he also wrote several fiction books and stories. And he was a professor of local history at Tacoma Community College for many years and influenced a generation of local history enthusiasts and scholars. As I think about his life, the more that I've learned about it, two things jump out to me personally as being interesting and significant. The first is the wonderful partnership that he had with his wife, Rosa. They were not just husband and wife, they were truly partners in his work. They were co-researchers, they were co-writers, and he often acknowledged that he could not have done his work without her contributions. Later in his life, he also collaborated with their daughter, Lane, in a similar way. So as the product of a family that has similarly worked together, in my case in music, I have great respect for unique and special family relationships like that. And secondly, I think it's significant that Morgan was always a man of his convictions. I have just a couple of examples of that. There are many more. But while he was a student journalist at the University of Washington, he was suspended briefly after reporting in the paper about the number of cases of sexually transmitted diseases that had been diagnosed on campus that year. I think it was 1937. He thought that was newsworthy and would be of interest to readers. The campus administration disagreed, and they suspended him, but even before the suspension, there were threats. He could have bowed down to the threats, but he held to his principles and said, no, this is important. And as the editor of the paper, I have the right to publish this. Later on, he would quit a job teaching at the University of Puget Sound and advising the student newspaper there. There was a student-written story complaining about the fact that the price of coffee had been raised in the cafeteria. Murray thought that it was a well-researched and well-written article, and certainly within reason what students would find interesting in their student newspaper. He was pressured to pressure the student to withdraw the article. He didn't just refuse, he quit. So I think it's significant when you come across people who are willing to stand behind what they believe in so consistently in their lives. I have a photograph here of a block print by Verna Hafer of what's now called the Murray Morgan Bridge. At the time she did this, it was called the 11th Street Bridge. And in 1997, it was officially renamed in honor of Murray Morgan. He didn't live to see its later restoration, unfortunately, but the renaming was fitting for many reasons. First of all, this is a historic bridge that has a lot of significance in our city's history. But he also actually worked as a bridge tender on this bridge in the 1950s. He needed the extra income briefly, and he also enjoyed the fact that on quiet nights he could get some writing done while he was on the bridge. So as I mentioned when I started talking about Morgan, I want to give him the last word in this section of my talk. I just last year read this book for the first time. It was originally published in 1979, so I've had many years in which to read it and no excuses why I didn't. But this recent re-release with an introduction by Michael Sullivan inspired me to finally purchase it and read it. And I wanted to read for a couple of reasons. Both, I think the section that I'm going to read, which is from the very end of the book, is intriguing and inspiring, and I also think it gives a little taste of his writing style, which takes a book which is, of course, a dance history book, which I think turns some people off just by the very look of it. It's very well researched and dense with facts, but it's a page turner, I promise you. I don't have patience for dull books. This is not one. This is a fascinating, engaging story, and I learned so much that I didn't know about local history when I read it. But I want to read the very end. This is the very last page of the book, and let his words take us out here. The City of Destiny remains unsure of what its destiny should be. The land is much changed from that which George Vancouver called the most lovely country that can be imagined, where the labor of its inhabitants would be amply rewarded in the bounties which nature seems ready to bestow on cultivation. Few would care to depend on cultivation of the land today. Nor will Tacoma ever be the metropolis of the Pacific that Job Carr envisioned that Christmas day when he stood in his canoe and shouted, "Eureka!" It is unlikely to become, as Alan Mason hoped when his earlier dreams of greatness had faded, a Philadelphia to Seattle's New York, though the possibility remains that it will be, as Radabaugh of the Ledger once predicted, a Liverpool to Seattle's London. The Tacoma of today, and remember this is from 1979, 187 years after Vancouver's visit, 128 years after DeLynn started his mill among the skunk cabbages, 115 years after Job Carr exulted in his first sight of the sheltered place, 106 years after the Northern Pacific chose Commencement Bay as its terminus, 81 years after Nelson Bennett undercut the Cascades, 76 years after the crash stilled the great boom, remains a city set in beauty, a city small enough for people to say hello on the downtown streets, a city where it is safe to walk at night and a morning's drive takes you to mountain or ocean, a city of easy access to parks and playgrounds, and to the more metropolitan delights of Seattle. In short, a pleasant place to live. An anonymous visitor to the Pacific Northwest, quoted in the January 12, 1894 issue of Harper's Weekly, had it right. Well, gentlemen, if I were a man of wealth seeking a home and investments on Puget Sound, I would live in Tacoma and invest in Seattle. Giving the final word there to Marie Morgan. So I wanted to share, I get these questions a lot, and I wanted to share the sources of my research for this talk, in addition to things I had in my own house, like that book and things belonging to my grandmother. But there is an enormous amount available for anyone stuck at home wanting to do local history research. Please feel free to reach out to us at Tacoma Historical Society with questions about how to utilize these resources, and we will be happy to help. And as I mentioned when I was talking about my grandmother, please do share your stories, and maybe this is a great time to do that. Maybe when you're having Zoom meetings with family that you can't see in person right now, share some stories from your past that maybe they haven't heard. Or even if they have, maybe they'll appreciate it more than the last time you shared it. And then finally, I want to share again, as we have been over the last several months, we acknowledge at Tacoma Historical Society that we're living through very unique times right now, and we want to document those for posterity. So we're offering 2 ways for you to share with us your COVID diary entry. We are taking text submissions, and we are taking audio submissions. And we will store these as part of our collection for the use of future researchers, potentially including them in future exhibits or displays. So please do take the time to contribute to that. If we're going to live through an unusual time like this, we may as well capture it and learn what we can from it. All right, thank you so much. It's been really a pleasure to share this with you.